Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thanks to HillVets for hosting our discussion tonight. My name is Jason Sydoriak. I served in the United States Marine Corps Infantry for 6 years, and I now live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, working for the U.S. Department of Transportation as an economist and transportation planner. Uh, I just had the honor of being a HillVets LEAD Protégé, which is a leadership development sort of fellowship, part of HillVets. And in that rendition of the last cohort, we put on a set of panels, and we're going to redo a panel because it was such a great conversation. And so as a HillVets Protégé alum, I have the honor of moderating this panel, The Weaponization of Information, Media's Role as an Instrument of Warfare in the 21st Century. Today, almost all of media is created and curated as social media through a network of applications that allow people to share and create content. And just like the importance of the radio during World War II as a determining factor to win both propaganda war and coordinating military assets, so too is of social media in the past decade. From Russian influence in Ukraine to the fall of the Afghan government, the world has been experiencing a method of warfare that is cheap, rapid, and devastating. The same techniques that a viral marketing campaign might use through platforms like Twitter and YouTube are now used for military strategic purposes. Today, our panelists joining me bring expert insight on this emerging phenomenon, and I'm delighted to introduce them. Marilyn D'Angelo is a managing member of the Counter Disinformation Resource Group. She's a thought leader in the field of disinformation, focusing on the domestic and international impacts of message manipulation and information warfare. Colonel Andrew Whiskeyman is head of U.S. Central Command's Information Operations Division for the U.S. Central Command Operations. His previous assignment was as the Chief of Strategy in the CENTCOM Joint Cyber Center and has written extensively on disinformation for the Washington Institute. Before we begin, I want to preface that these are the opinions of our panelists, and their comments do not necessarily reflect their employers' positions. So, getting to it. Marilyn, I want to start with you and just sort of get a lay of the land. What is the difference between misinformation and disinformation? And how does social media affect the application of these strategies?
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for having me. When we think about message manipulation, we've heard the terms mis and disinformation, and misinformation is very much that lowest common denominator. Disinformation, and more so malinformation, originating from sources that are maliciously fabricated, information that is purposely disseminated to select audiences with the intent to change behavior. Misinformation is more of the unintentional sharing of this thought stream. So when a government or a non-state actor, when someone puts out information that they're looking for confusion, they're looking to sow division, that is malinformation, disinformation. When a family member shares it, when someone who's not educated on the topic shares on social media, they're not deliberately sharing something that was put out. They are kind of spreading that information without that same intent. So it comes down to the intention behind the messaging. Social media has given us the range of, it allows people to reach wider audiences. Obviously, when it's whisper down the lane, things are a little bit more, you trust your sources when they're coming from someone you know. And social media has allowed those sources to reach exponentially more people. The danger there, I think, when we think about social being our platform, is that we're presuming the platform is giving us the information that we are asking for, interested in, and we think that because we are searching for it, it's true. The reality is that those feeds are being manipulated by the messenger, the algorithm. There's so many factors there that I think the end user and the receiver of the message doesn't quite recognize how many layers of manipulation have happened before they've gotten the information.
Right, great. Hey, Colonel Whiskeyman, what are some of the prominent examples of militaries and insurgent forces adapting these strategies to combat?
Well, I think if you look at the big two on this, you can look at what ISIS did in terms of leveraging really social media to brand themselves in a way that made them global and made them attractive to wide audiences to come join their global jihad. Very, very slick marketing and very astute use of social media platforms to reach a diverse group of audiences and really tweak the message that they delivered in a very targeted way. It was a very interesting use of social media. I think also when you look at the Russians' use of social media, particularly in what they did with Crimea and in the Ukraine, another fascinating look, and you're looking there at a state actor using social media in a way to really sow as Marilyn had mentioned with disinformation, kind of the discord and confusion, not really trying to get you to believe one thing, but coming up with a variety of alternatives to really paralyze anybody else's ability to answer what was going on. And then I think the third group, and not necessarily from a military perspective, but from a broader geopolitical perspective, is what China is doing. And the scale that China is using multimedia, to include that subset of social media, to really shape global messaging behind a variety of themes that China's government is pushing. And really, I would argue, in an attempt to win before fighting, in an attempt to set conditions so they don't need to use their military. So I think you look at those three, and I'm sure there are others we could walk through as well, but those are the three that really come to mind as being good examples of what this new landscape looks like and how governments and entities use social media to further their interests.
I think that's a really good point. It's really about creating the conditions to get what you want, but without having to go to war, without shedding that blood. And you could see militaries and insurgent forces really taking advantage of this type of combat, essentially. And it's rapidly advanced since people were really taking note of it in 2013 with ISIS, as you had mentioned. And Colonel Whiskeyman, I was wondering if you can go a little bit further with the Islamic State and how they utilize social media as a means to not only recruit forces, but also intimidate entire Iraqi units into a full-scale rout, ultimately winning them the battle space.
Yeah, I'm not sure that their social media presence is what triggered the collapse of the Iraqi units. I'm not sure that the Iraqi units were checking their Facebook accounts and seeing the march of ISIS and collapsing apace. ISIS had some really real victories on the battlefield that I think drove a lot of that. So there was a deeds and words match that they used. The majority of their social media use was really focused externally to external audiences, I think. That being a lot to the West, where social media use was rampant. After the fact with some of the branding, and I think they really used it in a very integrated way, which is not an approach that we tend to do, at least within the U.S. government that I've seen. Again, in my opinion.
Right. And it took a while for...
Right, we haven't done that integrated approach that we really need to get to.
Right, and it took a while for even other developed militaries to really take advantage of these tactics. Israel being, I think, a prime candidate of how they've sort of participated in their own conflict with Palestine. Marilyn, I was wondering if you could speak to the fact that traditional media tends to lag behind misinformation. And that can be seen during the ISIS surge, but also even the 2016 election interference. What makes misinformation and disinformation campaigns so potent?
Well, I want to answer your question, but I do want to go back to something that Colonel Whiskeyman said. Winning the fight before they ever actually have to enter a battlefield, right? So in warfare, none of this is new. Misinformation, disinformation campaigns, as old as history itself. But finding a way to attack an army without promoting an armed response or without having to resort to active conflict is the ultimate success. When we see actions out of China or Russia, if we consider targeted information campaigns as a form of social engineering, we can define this as a soft intervention or low intensity gray zone conflicts. The fact that it's all about perception. So if war and conflict are about perception and you're able to affect that change without ever entering an enemy's country, right? Without ever entering another space. Our adversaries have been able to capitalize on this so successfully. And I think that is our biggest challenge, is finding ways to utilize the strength of our tools, our media, our capitalist society, our economic strength, finding ways to use what we do well to fight this baseline propaganda that's coming out of other conflicts. Sure, we have insurgencies using very vivid imagery to show their dominance, to show their successes. They're using platforms that were developed in our country. They're using, technologies that are coming out of, they're ours. We've created them. So our allowance of the use of those platforms, first of all, and our expertise in them should give us the upper hand in this. And I think if we come around with a actual tactical plan as to how to use our tools to better message outwardly, I think we would be in a better position. The media is obviously independent, and you expect media to be independent. However, getting the message right coming out of the media is kind of the root of it all. If we can get our messaging on the same page, I think we could have a little bit of a better upper hand when it comes to the propaganda. So.
Right, and I think it's important to note that you're exactly right. These adversaries are not trying to fight on the front within our country, right? And they're not trying to defend their own borders. This is more about resources on the periphery and fighting for those battle spaces that create a buffer between us and them. So social media, having that distance, is kind of one of the perfect tools that you don't actually have to go into that space for these proxy wars, which is essentially what we're seeing with Ukraine and sometimes even Afghanistan. So I think that's an important point. And so I want to pivot towards Afghanistan because it's not only coming up on the 20-year anniversary, but obviously it's a really important development that we've seen these last few weeks. Colonel Whiskeyman, like we just noted with ISIS becoming the poster child for social media in asymmetric warfare, I want to talk about the Taliban and how over the last 20 years, they've become just as proficient with social media, albeit less flashier. Could you speak to the information war between the Taliban and the Afghan military as battles were waged on the ground in the last few months? So for instance, in many provincial capitals in like Lashkar, Helmand, there was a back and forth between the forces on social media describing what territories were gained and also casualty numbers. Could you just kind of speak to that?
Sure. So there was absolutely a battle for the narrative and for what was true, and perception absolutely plays a huge role in that. I mean, we could pull a thread on something Marilyn said earlier, and I think it broke up just a little bit, but I would categorize it as there's nothing new under the sun, right? In terms of that perception piece of trying to go forward. I mean, Genghis Khan would capture a city, leave one survivor, send them to the next city so that that city surrendered before he had to fight him. Well, that's a perception issue and an influence issue. The delta with social media is the projection you can get. Now, it's not just how far somebody can walk or run, but you can be global on it. And it's a battle space for what is actually true and what is happening. And I think you saw that play out between government of Afghanistan forces, ANDSF, and the Taliban forces. And so a unit or an entity that is more adept at getting their story out, showing a deeds and words match, because it's not just the pictures, it's where the picture is taken, right? It wasn't like the Taliban was using a sound studio and making up backgrounds. You know, they're showing pictures from where they physically are on the ground and then moving forward. So it's that match of the two, I think, that caused kind of that cascading or that perception of inevitability that was going on. And that really, to me, that's just my take, that was the change, is once that perception started to take hold, and once then other militias started to side with the Taliban, it became almost an irreversible momentum, that it really didn't matter what was going on. That perception was there on that. So, and not that the ANDSF wasn't using social media. Again, I think it was the deeds words mismatch. They didn't have the deeds to match what they were saying on the ground, and that became a delta of believability that really led to the change. So it wasn't a magic. I don't want to leave it the thought that somehow the Taliban magically figured out Facebook and just had a better marketing campaign, right? There were actually real tactical problems underpinning, and that combination of the two is really what set them apart.
Right. And so now that they are in control of much of Afghanistan, I'm curious to hear from actually both of you on what are some of the challenges that they're going to face, knowing that they're going to use social media to create a sense of legitimacy and stability moving forward, whether that's with the international community or really the fractured tribal environment that they're going to have to conduct in, which is a huge challenge to us and really any military that has tried to participate in Afghanistan. And Colonel Whiskeyman, since we just had you speaking, let's, if you'd like to take that question, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple things in that to unpack. The first is there's an assumption that the Taliban want international legitimacy. And I think that's important to note, because if you assume that they do, then there are certain other levers in government that can be used to incentivize their behavior. The economic tools, for instance, recognition of inclusion in different conferences and different governing bodies and norms, investments, those would all be things that would help with that piece. But if they don't really want international legitimacy, then none of those things are really going to help with what you're trying to do to get them to act or not act a certain way in accordance with international norms. Now, how they use social media, well, if you have control of the country, you have control of the internet service providers, the telephone networks, you can in many respects control or attempt to control the messages that are getting out, and only show, almost in an old Soviet-style Potemkin village, here's how wonderful things are in our little town. Everything looks great. North Korea is pretty adept at that, of trying to just show the images of what really looks good externally. And you could end up with some sort of a state that is similar in that respect. So I got North Korea is not Afghanistan, but just in terms of the control of media and the control of the image that's shown outwardly. I do think, though, the Taliban will have some struggles because you have 20 years of Western influence with expectations that grew exponentially of internet access to information, and ability to disseminate information that makes it a lot harder to keep videos from coming out, reports from coming out that show a delta, if there is a delta between what the Taliban say about how they're going to respect women's rights.
Colonel, you're lost on my end, so I'm going to kick it over to Marilyn.
To pick up where Colonel was kind of left off, I mean, the work that's been done over the last 20 years in Afghanistan is now established. I mean, work with women, with youth, people that have been empowered over the last 20 years. And those civil society and real world efforts are the foundation for any efforts moving forward. We also have the ability to connect with the diaspora population that is and will continue to grow. So legitimizing the Taliban's ask for legitimacy or search for legitimacy will be judged on the international stage. What propaganda they put forward will determine what it is they're looking for. And I think those signals are still very much to come. What is coming out of that area right now is highly inflammatory and sensitive, and everyone watching has the opinions of those watching are emotional, and I think that until we see an official united Taliban front kind of step forward to establish the type of government and international role they'd like to play, it is all just assumptions.
Right. And we're actually seeing some reports of media or social media resistance. I mean, in places like Kabul, there was a TikTok generation presence, and there's already an underground of individuals who have made it known that they're going to make an effort to shed light on Taliban activities to try to bring truth to that power.
I think it's difficult. You know, history has shown our lackings of a Western occupation force when up against an embedded insurgent force. Where I think we do win, and where I think we have our strengths, is in that long game. You know, those opportunities for education, better life, just really, you know, yeah, we're not going to convince an extremist terrorist to join, you know, the United States' culture. However, people who want different opportunities and supporters and allies that we've gained over the last 20 years in that region will continue to want those things for themselves, for their families, for their children. And I think that there is enough there that those connections won't be severed by this parentheses of time. You know, we're looking at a very specific interjection into our in our efforts as a country, and in their efforts and what they want for their reality. So I think that there's definitely been enough work done and enough connections still viable to hope for better and to push for better through civil society, through education, and through all of those on the ground connections that were made over the last 20 years.
Right, and that's the many sides of war. And pivoting to my next question, is looking at a different perspective of this. As we see with social media, it isn't just a warfighter on the ground that has influence on the battlefield. I want to talk a little bit about how veterans got into the fight these past few weeks by helping with evacuation from afar. Veterans and nonprofits use social media to share resources and even coordinate on-the-ground evacuations of U.S. citizens and Afghans in real time. How important is it to understand all dimensions of social media as a tool of warfare, not just misinformation and disinformation, but as a mechanism of humanitarian aid?
So just as any nonprofit or, you know, organization that seeks to reach their audience, social media is a unifier. It's a fantastic tool. When we're talking about veterans, you know, both active duty and, you know, we're talking about military personnel, both active duty and veterans, their communities online are super valuable and probably extremely, like I said, emotional right now. And I think that this time, the evacuation of Afghans, the evacuation of troops, people leaving a place that they've invested their entire adult lives into, seeing this come to an end in real time, seeing it manipulated online for the world to judge and for people who don't know to opine on, I think is a not ideal scenario, right? I would love to speak so intelligently on this, and I think it's a little trite for me to truly try to drop in on my thoughts on how a veteran would handle this. But I do think that the people doing the work and that have done the work are looking for support. I think that it's important for us as Americans to recognize that the people leaving Afghanistan are going to need help. The people that are standing next to them asking for help are Americans and valid, and their causes are valid. I think that the things that are going to come out on social media are going to try to inflame and evoke more divisions amongst the country and the political parties. And I think that people should be very sensitive to recognizing when those messages are going to be manipulated. And those manipulations are going to come internally, and they're also going to come from external actors, both state and non-state. And so when the people leaving and the veterans calling for support begin to be attacked or begin to become the victims of conversation of people that are not truly intelligent on what happened or their missions, then I think that's when everyone should take a step back and think about what's really going on here. This is going to be an opportunity for people to drive hateful rhetoric. It's 20 years since 9/11, and everyone's going to be pretty emotional. And I think kind of taking the time to recognize the opportunity for manipulation and kind of divesting from those sources would be the healthiest way to handle the next month for, I think, a lot of people, a lot of veterans, a lot of people that are going to be used and attacked virtually. So I think in my view of what's to come online out of this.
Yeah, it's
I
definitely.
don't know that answered any question that was direct, but those are my thoughts on that.
I think it's definitely going to be. I mean, it has been heavy these last few weeks, and veterans have, stepped up to the plate regardless of what the punditry has said, and a lot of them being able to get out their interpreters or the special forces that they've been working with. So I think you're spot on. Colonel Whiskeyman, I know you're dealing with some bandwidth issues, but I was wondering if you could speak on this topic as well, and perhaps maybe your own experiences that you may have had or heard of veterans really rising to the occasion and using different social media platforms to organize or help organize this evacuation.
Sure. A couple things. One, I mean, there are things ongoing. I'm not going to go into details about stuff that I've got because I don't want risk to what's actually ongoing to try to still get people out of country. But just know that it is ongoing. And when you look at, technology is neutral in many respects. And so we have to, I would offer, remove the emotion from the social media aspect, which is a good rule of thumb or heuristic to use on a point I think Marilyn made about the anger or the frustration. If you read something, if you read a post and you walk away feeling worse than you did before, it's probably a good idea to ask yourself, where did that come from? I mean, is that somebody just sharing something, which is, okay, that's a way to vent? Or is it coming from an external source that's looking to inflame the tensions that are already there? And so I think as a nation, we have to be really careful because our adversaries are going to pile proverbial gasoline on the fire for legitimate issues that people have to try to make them worse. And that's what they're trying to do, is sow discord with that piece. As for using social media, there's a number of fantastic tools out there to be able to communicate, for people to actually unite. So rather than using it as a source of division, we could actually turn our use of social media into a unifying factor around specific goals or around specific things we want to aspire to. And we got to keep in mind, as Americans, we've got a better story. I mean, I'm sure many of you have lived in a number of different places and visited a lot of different places. We got a great story. What a wonderful experiment these past 200 plus years, enshrined in the Constitution and our struggles to try to form a more perfect union. That's not the Taliban story. And where we can tell our story leads to that longer term success, I think, than just that short term, hey, I've got to win right now. Where we play to our strengths in that is having free and open discussions and debate, but without the hatred. Like, we have to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think as we all walk away from that, how do we each media, and how do we each look to use media in a way to really build up as opposed to tear down? I think I realize there's a whole lot there, but that's just like, there's a lot to unpack, I think, with what's going on as we look at kind of this operation unfolding in time. And I know, I mean, I've worked the past 3 weeks straight in CENTCOM as we tried to work the information support to this, this incredible NEO that went on, regardless of the politics involved. When you look at what a very small group of military members managed to do, it's pretty unparalleled in history what was accomplished in that, relatively safely, given the threats that were there.
Right.
Yeah, remarks complete. Sorry, you can't see my face with the bandwidth. Well, I didn't just cut out there, so I'm done with that thought.
Great. And we're actually going to start pivoting to our final set of questions. And we've got a question from our social media, in fact, about, oh, here it is, it's on the screen. Can you see that, my panelists?
Yep, can see the question.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Whiskeyman, would you like to take a first crack at this?
Yeah, sure. Done a lot of thinking about China in the CENTCOM area of operations and globally fairly recently, especially since their activity with COVID disinformation. The Chinese don't look to win hearts and minds. That's not a thing they're trying to do. They're trying to set conditions so that they maintain a position of relative advantage and an ability to operate in what helps China. Which, I mean, nation states do. That's something nation states do. But I would not offer that China is going to approach this the same way in terms of trying to lay out values that need to go on. They may look to do things that allow them freedom of operation. If, again, they're looking for the Belt Road Initiative and how that crosses Afghanistan, or more likely, how do they extract key minerals from Afghanistan, would really be, I think, the interest the Chinese would have in Afghanistan, not standing up necessarily Confucian institutes at Kabul University, although that may be something down the road. I don't think that's going to be that's an American-specific play that they have. Looking to us, I don't think that's the approach they're taking in there. What they will do, and what they are doing, is characterizing America's failure in Afghanistan, America's failure as a world leader, America's failure with COVID, America's failure as a partner on down the road. So they'll use social media to play that theme, I think, as opposed to looking to necessarily the approach we tried to take, which was, legitimizing the government of Afghanistan previously. Anyway, that's kind of the observations I have from just within CENTCOM. Over to Marilyn if you've got some other stuff, just given the broader research that you do.
I mean, when we talk about China and the internet, we have two very different models and two very different expectations. So where the United States wants to see and enables an open dialogue, China very much does not. Their surveillance apparatuses and policing uses and, paired with their technological advancements, they have a very different use case for their internet. I think when it comes to how China will interact in Afghanistan, when it's our sphere of influence, we are seeing it used in the ways that we use it. And without our sphere of influence, you're going to see a Chinese sphere of influence. So then I would presume, and it's a presumption, but if, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. If you say we said you are not allowed to use Facebook anymore and Google, and, if we took away American platforms, the place to go would be Chinese platforms and Chinese expectations and rules. The Chinese and the Russians have things like firewalls, and you can't get any information in, you can't get any information out. We don't operate under those conditions because the United States respects a free flow of information. Without those standards and expectations, the other option is a much more controlled and regulated system that will protect from outside information and will control what leaves. If China is to move into the area as an ally for the Taliban, then I would presume that we would see them move towards their model of internet usage and away from ours. I think that may work for China, or it may not. It may end up being China's quagmire for the next so many years. Depends on, I think, their goals there.
Yeah, and I'm actually wondering, as the last 20 years, that the Taliban, as I had mentioned, has become more proficient with social media and using it for propaganda purposes. And I haven't seen it in the readings that I've been doing for this. But I'm not sure who's been advising them, who has been providing them the training to conduct such a thorough campaign to become proficient with this type of warfare. I don't want to make assumptions, but I haven't really seen that question be thrown around. I assume that U.S. intelligence has an idea of who has taught a group of individuals in an insurgency that has a high illiteracy rate, how to use social media. I don't know if either of you could speak to that, but I have to assume who did provide them with that skill set would be a strong ally moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't speculate on who might have given them training. I will tell you that underestimating one's adversary's intelligence is never a good spot to be in. And the senior leaders in the Taliban have been very intelligent in how they've gone about the fight. And so just watching what's going on would lend one to probably explore. So there's probably a natural curiosity for seeing what's happened around the world with social media and moving into that space. Especially watching ISIS in their use of it, I think is probably an impetus for that. The other thing that we really have to factor into this is that insurgencies only really flourish if they have safe haven. One of the reasons the Viet Cong was able to survive so long is that we did not attack North Vietnam. They had safe haven. They could refit, regroup, rearm, and continue. That's a basic principle of counterinsurgencies. Don't allow your adversary to have sanctuary. Well, the Taliban had sanctuary in Pakistan. And so each year, or they're repeatedly able to move through that. Now, you can argue whether the Pakistani government was witting or unwitting in the amount of support they gave to the Taliban. Regardless, the Taliban had somewhere to go where they were not harassed. And you can take time to think, to learn, to refit, to regroup. And then I'm sure there are other external actors who would like nothing more than the U.S. to be stuck in Afghanistan, who are willing to, in some ways, provide some support. I think I would be foolish to think that that wasn't going on, even if you don't have, an intel stream feeding that. That would just be, I think, common sense approach to that. It would be interesting, though, from a study perspective, I think, to look at, from a methodical perspective, what were the changes in the Taliban's use of social media, and do we see patterns in how they progressed with how anybody else has been using it? That might be an interesting study. Thought complete.
Right, and I agree. It would be fascinating to see how they progressed. And Emerson Brooking, who wrote The Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media, he recently put out an article about the Taliban's development over the last 20 years with how they've used media and social media. And it doesn't get to the level of detail that I've been asking for, but it's a great article if you're interested in it. It is titled "Before the Taliban Took Afghanistan, They Took the Internet." So if you're wondering briefly how it conducted its media campaign from the beginning of the war to now, it's a great overview. Pivoting to our final section about the future of conflict using social media, the war in Afghanistan, it's over, and essentially, and there is no shortage of punditry proclaiming what we did and did not learn from the past 20 years. We cannot forget that the end of a large coalition military presence in Afghanistan does not mean an end to the global war on terror, nor does it diminish the threat of conflict with larger geopolitical rivals. what threats do we need to look out for in regard to media, social media being waged against us and our allies? And we'll start with you, Colonel Whiskeyman.
To me, the threat is, the coordinated effort that goes on. And there's a couple other things that I think factor into this too. One is the development of deepfake technologies, which, what somebody can create on their phone now in terms of quality of video is unbelievable when you look at the history of Hollywood. Well, when you take a nation state who applies resources to creating a fake story that then goes viral, that perception becomes a real challenge to counter against. So there's a quality of disinformation that's a challenge in terms of combating it. There's an understanding of when that's coming. So how do you observe media to recognize when a story is gaining traction and rapidly discern if that is generated by coordinated inauthentic behavior? Those are a couple areas where intelligence, I think, needs to move that it has not yet. It has really been focused on order of battle. But the digital landscape really needs to be a focus of where we spend some time watching what our adversaries are doing and where are we under attack. And then there's a bit of just, education that needs to go on. I would call it media literacy. Check your sources. Check multiple sources. Don't just read something and get angry and then act on it. That's a whole bit of being able to inoculate one's population against propaganda while at the same time maintaining that strength that makes us that freedom of speech, which is so important to our society, our way of life, and I think a better world, to have that discourse. So, but it is a tension, right? There is a tension between freedom and security. But an educated populace that is able to really look with a critical eye at what they're reading and who's saying it, where are the emotive words in the reporting, too many adjectives and adverbs and not just more factual statements, I think is an important part of us moving forward as well. And it's important for the military to add that into its training, because you don't want your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines being affected by propaganda. We saw that World War II, we saw that in the Korean War. We had a lot of soldiers who left. They were affected by the communist propaganda because we didn't do a good enough job inoculating them to what to expect.
Right. I'm hoping you can conceptualize it a little bit further. You wrote an article, The Axis of Disinformation, co-wrote, Propaganda from Iran, Russia, and China on COVID-19. I think a lot of people, when they think of warfare, even the global war on terror, they envision far-off battlefields that most of the American public will never, ever go to, and maybe not even have to imagine. But in reality, in some ways, in the digital space, this warfare is being fought in our own borders. I was wondering if you could speak briefly to that article and what we've been facing over the last year.
Sure. So Dr. Berger and I just examined what was going on largely within Iraq, which was an area that we've been doing assessments for some time on public sentiment. And when we started to examine the coordinated behavior of China, Iran, and Russia using state-owned media, so traditional media, television, print, using their embassies as spokesmen, Twitter, Facebook, etc., there was a coordinated disinformation campaign about the origins of COVID-19, blaming the U.S. Army in Fort Detrick, Maryland. And in our surveying, we found that upwards of 70% of Iraqis were believing that a foreign entity created the virus, and of that, 70% believed it was the U.S. And so we're losing a battle. Now, you think, okay, so what? They believe that's nonsense. Nobody's going to care about that. But where that does matter is that's the very time that as the U.S. we're entering into the strategic dialogue with the nation of Iraq about the future of forces, cooperation, trade, etc. And the population is now hating America, saying, you created this virus, you're making us sick, pressuring the government to not accept U.S. forces. At the very time Iran is trying to make gains in the region, Russia doesn't want us there, and China would like to be able to set up better access to oil. Oh, by the way, 64% of Chinese oil imports come from the Middle East, which is higher than the percent the U.S. had at the height of the Mideast oil crisis in the 1970s. So talk about dependencies of Chinese interests there, and how nations can come together using information as a weapon in order to further other aims. I think that's a fascinating example, relatively low cost, to really push America out of the playing field, or cast challenges back into the U.S. Discussions on COVID, which play into vaccine issues. It plays into masks debates. It plays into public policy. And you see the fallout in our own economy of challenges with that, and healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all not China putting boots on the ground or deploying aircraft carriers or moving outside of the South China Sea. That was all accomplished with an information campaign to make that change. And it's ongoing. I mean, that article is about a snapshot in time. But if you look at ongoing discussions of what China continues to put out, that hasn't changed in the rhetoric and the speculation. Again, that the U.S. created COVID to make China look bad. We spread it that just keeps hitting over and over and over again. And without, I'm not a fan of going, tit for tat on disinformation, trying to counter every bit of disinformation. But if you're not able from a public platform to really address key issues or seize an initiative with a narrative, you cede that terrain to your adversary. And we have found what we term the information golden hour, that if you don't have a competing narrative within that first hour, somebody starts to read something, once they make the decision to believe it, the biggest pile of facts doesn't pull them off of that, because they have internalized that decision to make that choice to believe something. And it becomes really, really difficult to change somebody's mind after that point. So when you look at warfare, and I'll finish with this point. When you look at warfare and you look at that use of information, especially in a society that believes the public determines government policies like we do, a vulnerable public to influence really shapes how you exist in the world, and how you're able to execute global policies, initiatives, economic investments, etc. So you really are vulnerable from information. We are vulnerable in that, I would say, much more so than more autocratic societies.
Yeah, really great point. And Marilyn, I'm hoping you can bring us home. And these campaigns, they're not just wielded against our allies like Iraq, as Colonel Whiskeyman just mentioned, but the same information, disinformation, these campaigns are being done, whether it's with COVID or elections here at home. And so I was wondering if you could speak to Colonel Whiskeyman mentioned being information literate and being responsible with how we utilize social media and media in general.
Absolutely. I mean, to go back to your last question, who taught the Taliban their social media tactics? I mean, you can hand a 2-year-old an iPhone and that child can use the iPhone. We've made these platforms very simple. We've made, the ability to go viral. I mean, the kids can do it. Anybody can do it, right? I know that's silly, but we've made it very user-friendly. What we've not made user-friendly and what we've not gotten the messaging out or on the same page about societally is that literacy piece, that internet etiquette. How are we to act online? How are we to treat others online? How are we to critically take in information? we sat down with a group, CDRG, with a group of educators last month to talk about how do we reach kids and how do we get them to critically think about the information they're taking in. How do we work on their filters? And to take the politics out of it, to take the politicization out of it, more so, it's the compare and contrast. Can you see the difference between these two pieces of information and recognize how they are being tweaked? And building that critical skill in youth, in adults, I mean, across the board, just recognizing that the same piece of information can be portrayed two different ways, and recognizing that that information is going to an audience deliberately. I think that level of understanding can be the route to help people navigate the information ecosystem that we are in. I think currently we are in the after effects of a successful attack on our democracy over the last decade. We are seeing critical mass of not trusting government, public health, authority, anything, any information that's being fed currently to the United States through their friends, through official channels. No one believes anything that they're reading now. Post-truth is, that's a hard reality to exist in, but that's where we are. No one trusts any message now. Now, how do we rebuild that skill? That was an effective and successful attack on the United States. We now have very little faith in the information we're given, and we have to work to rebuild that as a human function, as a societal function, and then we can move forward, because I don't think we've quite recognized the devastation from the last decade. So I think the education piece of that is really the only place to go. I mean, there's nowhere to go but up, right? Can we redefine what white and black and green and red are? Can we redefine what a legitimate source of information is? It's going to take some time. And I think working on those basic critical skills will start to get us there.
Right. In my opinion, a patriotic duty at this point. I think we really have to consider that if the way that we interact with information in the digital space could harm our national security, it's a patriotic duty to work responsibly with those materials. We're up against time. We were taking questions from the chat. We can take a quick question from the chat and finish this off. If not, we can end with some final thoughts. Give it a second if anyone wants to throw a question in there. All right. Marilyn, do you have any final quick thoughts for our discussion?
So I guess, we talked about the education piece. I think whether it's leaving Afghanistan or, doing some healing work at home or guarding against the next thing that's inevitably going to come, I think it's important that we all take a breath and a moment to recognize that the platforms we are using are there for emotional response, and engagement in that space will continue to give the output of disagreement. If we continue to be disagreeable to each other, I feel like we have to recognize that disagreement is okay as well, right? We have to come back around as a society, I would hope, to see us be able to disagree and find some peace within that as part of our society. I think we have to really drill back down on what it is to be an American and what it is to be in a democratic society, and remember those values, and really kind of do a hard restart on how we move forward in our communications with each other and our communications from our authority figures, and kind of, you know, how do you get back to center? And I think that, you know, it's an individual responsibility, it's an institutional responsibility, and I think kind of getting back to basics of allowing us to disagree with each other without making things so volatile, and recognizing that there are people working to ensure that volatility continues because it's in their best interest. So I don't know, just
Great.
trying to make a better world online, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Whiskeyman, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, sure. You know, the biggest thing for me is that relativism has not helped us. It's that post-truth thing, like anybody's truth is their own truth. That's really not real. I'm an X-Files fan. The truth is out there. So you have to get to the truth, which means you need critical thinking skills and you need an ability to debate and argue without being argumentative. So absolutely second, you know, just about everything that Marilyn is saying. It's spot on in terms of the need for how we have to be, you know, building a better community online. What are the norms of behavior? How do we consume media? These are not new problems, though. We just need to recognize that it's exacerbated because the manipulation that goes on in terms of the algorithms that are used. You have to recognize you're being manipulated and how you fight through to get the truth. That's important. But remember, we started a war with Spain. Remember the Maine? That was yellow journalism. This is not a new challenge that publics are manipulated by media. That happens. We have been naive thinking that whatever we're searching for online, I think, Marilyn, you mentioned this, is just true. If I find it online, it's true. We need a healthy skepticism. A healthy skepticism, give other people the benefit of the doubt that they're not evil. Talk to them a little bit. Human to human, I think, is important. And then how do we build that trust back? That's a harder question to get after. But if we don't start doing it, it's not going to get done. So we have to start somewhere. And so starting by having discussions such as this forum, moving out from there and continuing to talk about it and educate our friends, our families, our communities, schools is absolutely vital, important to going forward. You know, I hadn't considered something Marilyn said earlier about the attack we suffered on our democracy. And she said it very eloquently. Yes. And we have to recognize that we were, and we have to regroup and kind of figure out how do we move forward now. Because with trust being gone, we can't function effectively as a society. And that opens up avenues for our adversaries to excel. And I don't know about you all, but I've been a lot of other places, and there's not really many other governments I would want to live under. As flawed as ours is, I think we got it pretty good. Thanks for the opportunity to participate.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Colonel Whiskeyman, Marilyn, for joining us tonight and providing your insight. This has been a really incredible conversation. I've enjoyed it. And I hope you at home, you were able to enjoy it and learn something. Thanks to HillVets for hosting us. And yeah, this is the end. If you have the means and opportunity to help our Afghan refugee allies, please do. And with that, we'll end it. Thank you.